All right, Pam Bondi thought she had won. She sat through the hearings, she deflected the questions, she gave carefully prepared answers to some of the most explosive allegations in modern American legal history. And she walked out of that room thinking the worst was behind her. She was wrong. Because what just happened in the federal legal landscape didn't come from a congressman with a bank record. It didn't come from a political rival with a prepared speech. It came from the one institution in America that doesn't care about politics, doesn't care about optics, and doesn't care about who you used to be. The FBI just moved. And when you understand what they moved with, when you see the scale of what is now being assembled against the people who thought they were untouchable, you'll realize why the next chapter of this story is the most dangerous one yet. This isn't about one hearing. This isn't about one accusation. This is about a massive class action that has the potential to reshape everything. And it started with a file that Bondi apparently never expected anyone to open. Let's go back to where this actually began. Because the FBI doesn't move on impulse. It doesn't react to headlines. It doesn't file actions because a congressional hearing got tense or because the internet had strong opinions. When the Bureau moves at this scale, when the mechanism of a class action gets put into motion at the federal level, it means someone has been building something for a very long time in a very quiet place. The groundwork for what is now unfolding wasn't laid last week. It wasn't laid last month. The documents that are now surfacing in this legal action represent years of work, years of evidence gathering, years of building a case that prosecutors and investigators believed could survive the kind of scrutiny that only the most high-profile legal battles in this country receive. And Bondi, who has spent years positioning herself as someone who understands the law, who served as Florida's Attorney General, who knows exactly how these mechanisms work, apparently didn't see it coming with the force that it arrived. Here's what most coverage is getting wrong right now. They're treating this as a political story. They're framing it as one faction of Washington striking back against another. And that framing completely misses the actual legal architecture of what's happening. A class action at the federal level involving the FBI is not a political move. It is a legal instrument. It has specific evidentiary requirements. It requires the identification of a class of affected parties. It requires demonstrable harm. It requires a paper trail that connects the alleged conduct to specific quantifiable damage experienced by real people. The fact that this instrument is now being deployed is not a statement about politics. It's a statement about what investigators believe they can prove. So what is in the file? That's the question everyone is circling around and nobody is answering directly. Because the documents at the center of this action have been partially sealed, partially redacted, partially released in the kind of strategic drip that experienced federal litigators use to control the narrative as a case develops. But here's what has surfaced. There are financial records. Not allegations of financial records, not rumors about financial records. Actual documented transactions that investigators have been tracing across multiple jurisdictions, across multiple years, through a network of entities that were apparently designed to make the money move in ways that were difficult to follow, but not impossible. Because the FBI has people whose entire job is following money that was designed not to be followed. And they followed it. Here's where it gets genuinely complicated. Bondi's legal team is going to argue, and they have already begun arguing, that any financial relationships that existed were disclosed, were legal, were consistent with standard practice for individuals operating in the overlapping worlds of law, politics, and private advocacy. That argument has surface plausibility. People in Bondi's position routinely receive fees, donations, speaking compensation, consulting arrangements. The legal question is never whether money moved. The legal question is always whether the money moved in exchange for specific actions that the law prohibits. That's the line between compensation and corruption, and it is a line that federal prosecutors believe they can demonstrate was crossed. The class action framework is particularly significant here, because a class action isn't just about one wronged party seeking remedy. It's about a defined group of people who all suffered the same harm from the same conduct. When investigators structure this as a class action, they're making a very specific legal argument. They're saying the conduct in question wasn't isolated. It wasn't a one-time error in judgment. It was systematic. It was repeated. And it affected enough people in enough similar ways that the law demands a collective remedy. Think about what that means for a moment. If prosecutors can successfully certify this class, If a federal judge looks at the evidence and agrees that yes, there is a definable group of people who were harmed by a consistent pattern of conduct, then the liability exposure doesn't scale with one individual's capacity to pay. It scales with the harm done to every member of that class. And depending on how broadly that class is defined, depending on how many people investigators have identified as affected, the financial and legal consequences could be unlike anything that has emerged from any previous investigation touching these circles of power. Now, here's the part that nobody in the political media is willing to say directly. Bondi has been in rooms, important rooms, rooms where decisions were made that had consequences for real people. She has been at the intersection of law enforcement priorities, political relationships, financial networks, and policy decisions for decades. The career she built was built precisely on being someone who operated effectively at those intersections. That same career, those same relationships, that same proximity to power is now the exact architecture that federal investigators are mapping. Every meeting matters. Every transaction matters. Every decision about what to pursue and what not to pursue during her time in positions of authority matters, because investigators aren't just asking what she did, they're asking what she didn't do and why, and whether the reason she didn't do certain things connects to financial relationships that were active at the same time. That's the most dangerous question in any investigation. Not did you do the wrong thing, but did someone pay you not to do the right thing? Let's talk about the class action mechanism specifically. When you file a class action, you're not just filing a lawsuit. You're making a public argument, a documented, legally structured argument that a systemic wrong occurred. You're saying to a federal court, here is a group of people, here is what happened to them, here is how it's connected, and here is why it requires a collective legal remedy. The certification process alone requires a level of evidentiary showing that filters out weak cases. The fact that this has moved to where it is means that someone with legal authority and investigative resources believes the evidence clears that bar. That's not a small thing. That's not political theater. That's a substantive legal judgment made by people whose careers depend on making those judgments correctly, and Bondi knows this. Whatever she says publicly, whatever her legal team says in press statements, she understands exactly what it means when the federal legal machinery moves against you in this form. She was an attorney general. She has watched these mechanisms from the inside. She knows how cases get built. She knows what it means when investigators have been quiet for years and then suddenly aren't. The silence before this was not absence, it was preparation. Here's something that's being lost in the noise. The revenge framing and how people are describing this is emotionally satisfying, but legally misleading. The FBI doesn't do revenge. The FBI does evidence. When people say the Bureau is striking back, what they mean is that investigators who have been building a case have reached a threshold where the evidence justifies action. That's a very different thing from institutional revenge. And the distinction matters because it means this isn't going to go away when the political winds shift. A class action with federal backing, built on documented financial records and verified transaction trails, has its own momentum. It exists independent of whoever happens to be sympathetic or hostile to Bondi at any given moment in Washington. The law doesn't care about political dynamics. The evidence doesn't care about who's currently in favor. The class of affected parties doesn't care about optics. They care about the harm they experienced. And they now have a legal vehicle moving on their behalf. What happens next is the part that should make everyone pay very close attention, because the class action is the public face of something much larger. Behind every public legal filing, there is a private investigative apparatus that is significantly more developed than what gets submitted to the court record. What prosecutors file is what they're ready to defend in open court. What they have is always more. The documents that have been released are a fraction of the documentary record. There are threads being pulled that haven't surfaced yet. There are witnesses who have provided information that hasn't been disclosed. There are connections being mapped that will only become visible when the next filing drops. Bondi's legal team is going to fight this hard. They're going to challenge the class certification. They're going to attack the evidentiary foundation. They're going to make procedural arguments about standing, jurisdiction, the scope of the alleged harm. These are the standard tools of high-powered defense litigation, and they sometimes work. But here's the thing about cases built over years by investigators who knew they were going to face those challenges. Those cases are built specifically to survive them. Every procedural vulnerability gets anticipated. Every evidentiary gap gets addressed. The people who put this together knew exactly what arguments were coming, and they built around them. The most important thing to watch right now isn't the legal filings. It's the silence. Watch who isn't talking. Watch which former allies have gone quiet. Watch which financial relationships have suddenly become very difficult to trace through public records. Watch which people who were previously very visible in Bondi's orbit have started declining interviews and public appearances. Because the class action is the headline. But the real story is in the edges of the frame, in the people who understand what is coming and are already trying to decide where they stand when it arrives. Someone always talks. Someone always decides that protecting themselves is more important than protecting the people who thought they had everyone's loyalty locked in. That calculation is happening right now, in private conversations, in lawyers' offices, in the quiet spaces where people who know too much start doing the math on what their silence is worth and what their cooperation might buy them. The FBI knows this. They're watching those calculations too. Here's the uncomfortable truth at the center of all of this. Pam Bondi is not a minor figure caught in someone else's story. She is a central figure in a network that spans decades of Florida politics, national legal policy, and financial relationships that are now being examined under the brightest possible light. The class action isn't targeting her because she wandered into the wrong room at the wrong time. It's targeting her because investigators believe she was a load-bearing wall in a structure that caused documented harm to a definable group of people. That's the allegation. That's what the legal machine is now pointed at. And the machine is moving, quietly, methodically, with the patience of an institution that has been doing this for over 100 years and has seen every defense strategy that exists. The final chapter of this story has not been written, but the first pages are already in the court record. And they are not going away. Stay close, because the next filing is coming. And when it drops, you'll want to have understood what you just heard.